Endeavor, Horizons of the Infinite, Episode 6. Endeavor to Find New Civilizations. By Elton Garr. The door chimed, and before Adrian could tell them to come in, it chimed again. At least he knew who it was. So he said,
"Endeavor, let the chief in."
James Fields, the Endeavor's chief of flight operations, was in the ready room before the door was fully open, and halfway across the small room before it closed behind him. As he approached the captain, he said,
"We need to go to RX'-74 and confirm the native species is not sentient."
"It's good to see you, James. How is the third shift working out?"
James stopped in mid-stride, then said,
"It's third shift. The most exciting thing that has happened was when Bethany started to snore at ops."
Adrian wasn't sure James was cut out for life on a starship. People told stories about the excitement, but those moments were thankfully rare. And the third shift was worse. James was the one who planned out the ship's routes, and that included adjusting the speed so that the ship didn't arrive while Adrian was asleep.
Second shift has been running training simulations.
"I'd like to talk about our mission,"
James said.
"I assume this is from Asteron Dynamics,"
the captain said. James was the liaison for Asteron Dynamics, which was the only reason he was in command of third shift. But not giving the liaison for the most powerful corporation in the Commonwealth, and the people paying for almost everything, was simply bad politics.
2 years ago, a scout visited RX'-74. He claimed a native species had significant signs of intelligence. Asteron Dynamics has ordered us to refute his findings.
And should reality be involved? Or can we save some time by not bothering to go at all?
They would prefer it looks like we investigated,
James said, missing Adrian's sarcasm.
They can't order us to break the law. And the law is clear. We can't colonize a world with intelligent life. If they're intelligent, they own the planet.
Which is why it is important that RX'-74 doesn't have any sentient species. What it has is at least one deposit of miranite,
the chief said. Miranite was rare enough to make even a single vein valuable enough to colonize a planet. And because it was used in weapons manufacturing, the Commonwealth would give them more leeway to getting it.
Asteron Dynamics can order us to investigate. But if the aliens on that planet are intelligent, my report will reflect that,
the captain said.
I understand your position. I'll tell the commander she should begin to prepare for a survey,
James said, turning to walk out of the room. His point seemed obvious, and one that Adrian might have missed if he had been less eager. It didn't matter what the captain believed if Tabitha was the one who wrote the report.
I think I'll do this one. I haven't been off the Endeavor in a month,
the captain said.
The aliens are dangerous. They attacked the scout, killed his dog, and he barely escaped,
James said. He sounded genuinely upset, though Adrian doubted it was out of any concern for Adrian's safety. Most of the command crew believed that if something happened to Adrian, they would either be promoted or reassigned. James just didn't have the patience to hide it.
I wouldn't want anyone to think that I ordered people to do things because I'm afraid to do it myself,
Adrian said. Then when James didn't move, he said,
Dismissed, Lieutenant Commander.
Over the next few days, Adrian memorized the report on RX'-74. The story was interesting, but it wasn't conclusive. Still, focusing on it helped him avoid thinking too much about whether leading the survey mission was a good idea. Adrian hadn't just stayed on the ship because that was where the captain should be. The Endeavor was filled with brilliant men and women who had been picked for their expertise. Commander Hester, who led most of the away missions, had been an undercover agent for Helix for 4 years and was both genetically altered and trained to go into dangerous situations. Adrian had spent those same years as the captain of a cargo ship. But he couldn't send her, for the same reason he couldn't send the doctor. Both were too focused on career advancement to put the good of an alien species ahead of their own. He believed, given time, he could break through that. Tabitha was already beginning to adjust her command style. But every time he tempted her, he risked losing his progress. And all Asteron Dynamics wanted was the Miranite. They had no genuine interest in running large colonies. Even the location wouldn't be all that detrimental. No one could live near a Miranite vein. The good news was that the captain wouldn't be entirely on his own. Regan was next on the shuttle rotation, so would be the pilot for the mission. He would also take the Endeavor's AI. He didn't fully trust the AI, but it had become an unofficial policy to take the drone. So finding out if it was a good policy was valuable. In theory, they could risk the drone, and if it was destroyed, it wouldn't even harm the ship's AI. But he wasn't sure it would work. The Endeavor was a level 10 AI. That gave it a lot more room to develop its personality, and what it had developed was timid. It had nearly panicked the first time it had faced space combat, and just last week he had to convince it to move closer to a star while recharging because it feared the radiation might damage its circuits. And the last member of his team was Johnny Forbes, a biologist who hadn't been on an away mission yet. When he arrived in the shuttle bay, he expected to find Regan. In almost 4 years of working with her, she had arrived before him on every mission and shift. Instead, Chief Fields was doing the standard shuttle inspection. The captain understood. He hadn't actually ordered Regan on the mission. He had seen the pilot rotation and hadn't needed to. But James wrote the pilot rotation and could change it. He could order him to get Regan, but it would be an insult to the chief, who was her direct superior, and it would make Adrian look silly, so Adrian said,
I didn't know this planet required someone with your skills to land on safely.
The chief grinned knowingly. James was a blunt weapon, and one that made Adrian fear that Asteron Dynamics had some other backup other than their liaison. His mind went to the small box that the engineers still hadn't been able to learn much about, except that they were fairly certain it had a large amount of stored computer data. And Asteron Dynamics were the prime suspect since they had more access to the ship than anyone.
Regan has no combat training, and the wildlife is aggressive.
Which is why I have a drone and a gun,
the captain said, but he had to admit that James's military experience would be useful.
And now you have someone else who can use that gun,
the chief said, taking the pilot's station. Sitting at the back of the ship was the drone. It looked identical to every drone on the ship, but it wasn't. The engineers were modifying it to be an avatar for the ship's AI. So far, they had boosted its processing speed, but the plans were to make it modular with arms, legs, and even a head that could be changed out for different missions. That only left Mr. Forbes. But he couldn't imagine the man taking long. Adrian had told him they'd be going down as soon as the Endeavor was in a stable orbit. 5 minutes later, the chief took off without him.
Our biologist isn't here yet,
the captain said.
I can circle back. But it doesn't take a biologist to scan brainwaves,
the chief said. He was right. The biologist was an excuse to not bring the doctor. So he said,
fine. Fewer people on the surface make it less likely we damage their culture.
Finding the target location wasn't difficult. The gray spot left by the Miranite was visible from orbit. But they landed several miles away. Asteron Dynamics already knew that was there. They wanted to know what was nearby. It was possible they simply wouldn't find any natives, and that could solve the problem. Stepping out into the world, Adrian was reminded of his childhood dreams of becoming a scout. There was something intoxicating about the idea of having no responsibilities, and the freedom of being able to go where you wanted and doing what you wanted. But he could never spend that much time alone. He liked to be around people. He even liked James, who was clear he didn't reciprocate those feelings. He was met with a powerful, wobbling howl. A few seconds later, there was a reply from the other side of the ship. It was similar, but different. And the pitches and tones were unique enough, he could imagine it was a language.
At least they won't be hard to find,
James said, and he put his hand on the gun at his belt.
Hand it over,
The captain said, holding out his hand.
What?
There are trank guns in the shuttle,
The captain said. He didn't like to tell his officers he didn't trust them, but James jumped into things without thinking. And shooting what might be an intelligent creature wasn't how Adrian wanted to start his first mission. James showed no weapons discipline as he held the gun out to the captain barrel first. And for a moment, Adrian wondered if he was considering shooting him. Without the drone here, he might get away with it. With that done, the captain picked a more or less random direction and began to walk. The bushes limited those choices, and he feared that the twisting and turning might make returning difficult. But the drone would be connected to the shuttle. James held the small trank pistol like you might expect someone in an action movie to hold a gun, the barrel up near his cheek, and he moved constantly. The man had been in the military. How was he this bad with a gun? They were barely out of range of the shuttle when something stepped out of the bushes behind them. It was sleek black and almost as tall as a human, though it was on all fours. The body seemed designed to move effortlessly through the thick bushes, coming out of them almost silently. It made more noises. It was quieter, and included yips and barks, as well as more traditional language sounds. That was a good sign of intelligence. If it was hunting, it would have just attacked. James fired before Adrian could respond. The trank was much quieter than a bullet, but it was still loud. And as the enormous creature took a couple of staggering steps, it said something much quieter, then collapsed. And as soon as it was down, howls of anger came from every direction. They were surrounded. And whether they were intelligent, suddenly became far less academic. James, who had shot, turned to run towards the shuttle. But Adrian grabbed him and said,
"They're predators. Run and they'll chase you."
They're going to kill us,
James said.
Not if we convince them we didn't hurt their friend,
Adrian said, and he held up his hands as he moved slowly towards the now sleeping creature. The drone moved with the captain, but though it was unlikely that they could injure the drone, it wasn't fast enough to protect Adrian from more than one or two. The alien was less asleep than Adrian would prefer. The standard trank dose was low to prevent overdosing aliens whose biology they didn't know. But at least the counter-agent should act quickly. It still required moving next to its enormous head, and more notably, the huge teeth. Its eyes were massive, and it watched Adrian. He pushed the automatic syringe into the large muscle at the back of its leg. That brought him perilously close to foot-long claws used for tearing flesh. It would wake quickly, and Adrian needed to be out of range when it did. But any quick movement could trigger an attack. So he took 2 long but slow steps back. There was more noise from the bushes. This time more confused than angry. The scout hadn't been guessing about their intelligence. The only reason there was any question was because Asteron didn't like the answer. And as if to confirm that, the translator in his ear made a small cheerful chirp. It was detecting a language. He just needed to live long enough for it to decipher the language, and might find a safe path out of this for everyone. He needed to get them talking, so he said,
"We're not here to hurt anyone. My friend was just surprised."
The huge leopard-like creature shook its head, likely still a bit confused by the different drugs in its system. Then it made a noise, significantly more like a language.
We're not friends,
James said from behind the captain. It didn't seem like the best time for that, but at least James wasn't panicking. That was when another alien stepped out. It was bigger than the first, and its black fur was graying. Behind it were 2 smaller creatures, each still as big as a human. Still in the bushes were the heads of others too small to be adults. This was an entire pack. The gigantic creature ignored the humans. Instead, it approached the alien that had been shot with a trank. It sniffed it, then walked around it carefully, then lowered its head and growled, then barked. Then, in the middle of a sentence, the translator said,
"And yet you insisted we all come."
They didn't prove they're demons. And they didn't hurt me. We surprised them, and they reacted how we would.
"We should kill them,"
the larger of the two said. The other growled and stepped forward, but Adrian saw the way its foot dragged along the ground. The drugs in its system were slowing it, and if they fought, it would lose. He considered the trank gun. But if he started shooting, a fight would break out, and even winning that fight wouldn't solve the bigger problem, because that problem wasn't on the planet. Asteron Dynamics wanted those minerals, and if they couldn't use the Endeavor to get it, then they would have to question why they were funding the ship. He needed someone on his side, and at the moment, the only one of those was about to lose a fight. So he decided to act. He had understood the tones in their voices, even without the language. That suggested they might be more human than he would expect. So perhaps he could understand them. This was a species that respected strength. He hoped that also meant courage as he moved forward. He stepped between them and stretched his hands out the same way he might stop two drunks in a bar from fighting. Then, with only a small hope that the translation had gotten far enough, he said,
"Stop,"
as loud and as firm as he could. They both started backwards, and the one with the hints of gray actually sat down for a moment, then jumped back to his feet. Then the younger said,
"You speak."
Stop was fairly easy, and he couldn't even be sure that was translated exactly, so he needed to be careful. If he said something that was gibberish, they could assume the other was just coincidence.
"We learn,"
Adrian said, with no idea what concepts the clearly primitive and non-humanoid race had. Intelligence, especially the type that came in a novel form, didn't always understand the universe the way humans did.
"We saw you come from the pit,"
The larger of the two said, the translator missing the last word, which suggested it likely wasn't sky. More likely, it was something more personal to their race. Perhaps based on their religion.
"We are from far away,"
Adrian said, trying to stick with words that the translator had heard, though the machine was remarkable and often able to make connections Adrian didn't understand even after they were explained. The creature looked up where they came from and said,
"Are there many others like us there?"
"There are none exactly like you. That is why we want to understand you better."
"They want something from us. You can smell it on the other one too." "I know you can,"
the older alien said. The hair on his back was raised, and he looked ready to spring. Adrian considered it, then brought out the small piece of miranite he had gotten from the ship's geologist. A child hissed, and several others jumped back, and Adrian realized he hadn't really considered the miranite from the perspective of the people who lived in this world. This was already processed. But it still looked largely the same, but in its natural form. But its ability to kill was what made it useful to Asteron. And would be terrifying to the natives.
"That is death rock,"
Another said, moving backwards.
"Do not worry. My people can protect you from them. And if you will allow us access, we will remove them from this world."
"It is not the way of things to help someone and gain nothing,"
The alien said. This was the part that he had less faith in. They didn't seem to own anything. They didn't even have hands, but he needed them to understand the concept of trade. But he couldn't change course now, so he said,
"It is valuable to us. If there is something valuable to you, we would trade it to you."
For the first time, the creatures turned away from them and began to discuss something among themselves. That seemed a good sign, because if they didn't have a concept of trade, they wouldn't have anything to discuss. Finally, it turned back and said,
"We will guard you while you gather the material. In return, we will need food, water, and a secure location to sleep."
Adrian resisted the urge to laugh. If they had just done what Asteron had wanted, they would have had to hire dozens of security guards who would likely be less effective on this world than the natives. And on top of security, he had a feeling that the natives would teach them about the world. And they wouldn't have to pretend that the natives weren't intelligent. Something tough enough that the obvious solution would be to get rid of them. Over the next few days, the captain learned more about the aliens and tried to explain how to negotiate with Asteron Dynamics. They would almost certainly still be drastically underpaid, but he could make sure that they knew what existed so they could negotiate better and hopefully help them have more say in their future than they would have without his advice. Author's note:
the elevator pitch of this series has always been Star Trek in a corporate oligarchy. This is the story I think leans most into that, because it touches on several Star Trek themes and ideas, but also doesn't step away from the idea that they work for a group of corporations. The obvious thing that I didn't get into directly was the Prime Directive. There isn't one, of course, but I was able to touch on it and remind people that while the idea is flawed, it exists for a good reason. And that's because even with Adrian doing what he can, it's still a compromise that isn't great for the inhabitants of this world. One that wouldn't happen if you had rules in place that said they weren't allowed to influence their culture. I'll also take a moment to remind you I am a week ahead on Patreon, so if you're reading this, the next episode is already at patreon.com/Elton, along with dozens of Patreon-exclusive short stories and more. Thank you. Elton Gar.